Hey guys, tonight we'll listen to a strange yet calming story, a boring but fascinating tale, where Roman senators, those highly respected men who ran the empire, were obsessed with perfumed goats. Sounds strange, right? But when we dive into their history, every scent, every perfume, and every goat tells a story of its own. So go ahead, dim the lights, put on your headphones, and let's begin tonight's boring but soothing story. Why Roman senators were obsessed with perfumed goats. You sit in a marble hall, faint light flickering against walls carved with Latin inscriptions. The air is thick, not with dust or incense, but with the peculiar sweetness of something musky, oily, and unmistakably goat-like. This, believe it or not, is the scent of power in ancient Rome. In the late Republic and early imperial period, Roman senators were not just lawmakers, they were symbols. Every fold in their toga, every ring on their finger, and yes, every scent that clung to their bodies carried meaning. The Roman elite were obsessed with perfumes, oils, and aromatic substances. Yet in a world where luxury met superstition, the strangest fascination was with the musk of goats. Particularly, perfumed goats bred and bathed to produce the finest scent base for oils and ointments. You might be imagining a marble-smooth senator reclining in his villa, sipping watered wine while a slave gently brushes fragrant oil on his neck. That's accurate, but only partly, because behind that luxury was a network of goat farms stretching across the Mediterranean, from the hills of Campania to the islands of Crete. These weren't ordinary farms. They were perfumed sanctuaries where goats were washed, brushed, and scented with crushed herbs, olive oil, and resins. The Romans believed scent wasn't just cosmetic, it was moral. The smell of your skin reflected your virtue. To smell foul was to be morally corrupt. To smell refined, like myrrh, balsam, or the faint sweetness of goat musk, was to show civility, restraint, and superiority. And thus began the strangest luxury race of its time, the competition to smell the most Roman. The goats used for this purpose were raised with ritual precision. In agricultural texts like those of Columella and Varro, we find small notes on animal care, the boring sections skipped by many historians. Yet hidden there are clues. They speak of goats being fed aromatic herbs like thyme, rosemary, and lavender. Their milk would then carry the fragrance used to make scented balms and soaps. Some farmers even rubbed the goats' horns with oil to make them shine. A small vanity, perhaps, but one that made these animals objects of pride. But why goats? Because goats were paradoxes, humble yet divine. In mythology, goats were associated with Pan, the god of nature, music, and fertility. Their musk was wild, primal, and oddly human. For senators who lived in marble silence, wearing the scent of a perfumed goat was a way of touching something real, something ancient. It was as if by smelling of goat musk, refined and diluted through oils, they carried both civilization and wilderness in a single breath. Perfume merchants along the Via Sacra made fortunes selling goat-based oils. One shop in Pompeii, before the eruption, advertised Oleum Hircinum Suavissimum, the sweetest goat oil. It wasn't cheap. A small flask could cost a month's wages for a laborer, yet senators imported it by the amphora. The perfumed goats of Campania were as prestigious as the peacocks of the East. And of course this led to absurd rivalries. Pliny the Elder writes of senators who wore so much perfumed oil that they glowed like marble in the sun. Cicero mocked his opponents for smelling of goat more than sense. Yet even he was said to keep small jars of scented oils in his home, claiming they were gifts of Apollo. Still, there was a deeper layer, one the common people didn't see. Roman baths were not just for cleaning, they were theaters of smell. The senators gathered, their bodies glistening with oils, the air thick with competing perfumes. Each fragrance was a statement, of wealth, of taste, of belonging. But goat musk, that faint, warm, persistent scent, was something else. It was endurance, a smell that stayed long after the bath, after the toga, after the words of the Senate faded into marble echoes. When archaeologists opened sealed amphorae from Roman villas, they found traces of fatty acids consistent with animal oils, likely goat or sheep. Mixed with balsam and rose essence, these were luxury blends, possibly used for anointing. The smell, if recreated, would have been earthy, sharp, slightly sweet. Perhaps unpleasant to us, but to them it was the aroma of civilization itself. And maybe that's what makes it fascinating. Beneath all the elegance, Rome still smelled like goat. Even the most powerful men couldn't escape the scent of the fields that fed them. In every perfumed gesture, there was a trace of the wild. But perhaps the strangest part is this. These perfumed goats were not just commodities. They were symbols of purity, fertility, and good fortune. Some senators even kept them as sacred animals, believing that their scent could ward off disease and misfortune. Perfumed goats were paraded during festivals, decorated with flowers and draped with gold-threaded cloth. Their smell filled the air, thick, heavy, and oddly holy. And yet one can't help but wonder, was this obsession truly about purity, or was it just vanity dressed in the scent of divinity? The next morning you awake to the faint sound of distant hooves. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Rome. Not the grand marble avenues of travel posters, but the quieter alleys behind the markets, where bakers, slaves, and perfumers begin their day. The air hums with the smell of bread, olive oil, sweat, and that ever-present note of something musky, goat musk. For the Romans, smell was not only a luxury, it was a spiritual language. It connected heaven, earth, and the human body in invisible threads. Every temple burned incense, every home stored oils, every ritual involved scent. Yet while frankincense and myrrh came from the far reaches of Arabia and India, the humbler goat was close at hand. And over time its smell, refined and perfumed, became sacred. If you were to follow the trail of those perfumed goats, you'd find yourself in the countryside, in the rolling pastures of Campania or the volcanic slopes of Sicily. Farmers there had discovered something remarkable. The milk and sweat of goats fed on aromatic herbs carried their fragrance. They called them caprae unguentae, the ointment goats. These animals were brushed daily with olive oil, then rinsed with water mixed with crushed lavender and thyme. Their coats gleamed. Their scent, even in the wind, was said to linger like incense. Ancient agricultural writers such as Varro and Columella didn't see this as strange. To them, scent was part of animal husbandry, another way to refine nature. Columella even advised, "Let the goat smell cleanly as the man who tends it." It's a curious line, half pragmatic, half philosophical. The farmer's work and the senator's luxury were connected through a shared obsession with smell, one shaped by centuries of ritual and superstition. In Roman religion, goats carried deep symbolic weight. They were both sacred and unclean. In the Lupercalia festival, one of Rome's oldest, young men would sacrifice goats to the god Faunus, smear the blood on their foreheads and run through the city, striking onlookers with strips of goat hide to bless fertility. The smell of goat musk filled the winter air. Even after centuries, the ritual survived, though softened and perfumed. The raw scent replaced by its refined cousin in the Senate halls. So when senators rubbed themselves with perfumed goat oil, they weren't just indulging in vanity. They were reenacting a memory of Rome's most ancient rites, where goat scent was protection, power, and rebirth. In their minds, to carry that scent was to carry the favor of Faunus himself. In fact, several Roman temples kept sacred perfumed goats. The historian Suetonius hints that Emperor Augustus maintained a small herd in his villa at Capri, not for milk or meat, but as omens. Their behavior was observed for signs of fortune. A restless goat meant unrest in the provinces. A calm one meant prosperity. And yes, they were brushed daily with oils made from rose and balsam. Over time, this ritualized care blurred the lines between religion and fashion. The Senate chambers, already filled with incense from temples nearby, became a kind of perfumed theater. Senators would arrive wearing different oils, some of spikenard, others of cinnamon or goat musk, and the mingling smells created a strange harmony. Pliny the Elder, always skeptical, complained that the air of the Senate smells more of Arabia than of virtue. But there was another reason the goat scent persisted: medicine. Roman physicians believed the musk of goats had healing powers. The natural oils extracted from their skin glands were used to treat fainting, fever, and even melancholy. The famous physician Galen described goat oil as warming to the heart and steadying to the nerves. Mixed with herbs, it was applied to temples and chest, and sometimes consumed in small doses. For the sleepless or the anxious, yes, even in ancient Rome, goat-scented ointments were thought to bring calm dreams. In some households, perfumed goat oil was rubbed into pillows or burned in small lamps beside the bed. Imagine that. As senators drifted to sleep, the faint scent of goat musk filled their rooms, the same smell that hovered over their debates by day, and so, scent became both armor and lullaby, a way to guard the body and soothe the mind. Still, not everyone was pleased. Satirists of the late Republic mocked these habits mercilessly. The poet Martial sneered that Rome smells not of glory but of goat. Juvenal accused senators of hiding their decay beneath perfume. But no insult could erase the ritual. To smell of goat, clean, perfumed, and sanctified, was to smell of status. It meant one had risen far from the sweat of the fields, even as one carried that memory in disguise. By the 1st century CE, the trade in perfumed goat oils had become an industry. Merchants in Ostia imported exotic essences, cardamom, cedar, saffron, and blended them with local goat fat. Slaves were trained to distill and store these oils in sealed amphorae, each labeled by scent and region. The richest blends came from goats raised near Capua, where the volcanic soil gave herbs a stronger aroma. Their oils were thick, golden, and faintly sweet, the most sought-after base for Roman perfumes. Some of these amphorae still survive, sealed in the ashes of Pompeii. When opened, traces of organic compounds confirm what ancient writers hinted at. Many Roman perfumes had animal origins, and among them, goat oil was common, used not only for scent but also as a stabilizer, giving perfumes their lasting power. Without it, the fleeting notes of rose or cinnamon would fade too soon. The senators may not have known the chemistry, but they knew the result: endurance, the scent that lingered, the presence that lasted longer than the voice. Think of it this way. In a world before deodorant or synthetic fragrance, goat musk was not simply tolerated, it was admired. It was the smell of a world that had learned to polish nature rather than erase it. The senators' perfumed goats embodied the Roman dream: to refine the wild until it served the civilized. But beneath the polished marble and perfumed oil, there lingered a quiet question, one whispered even in those days. If civilization needs the wild to define itself, then what happens when the wild scent fades away? Imagine Rome a century later. The marble still gleams, but the perfume has changed. The air that once shimmered with the scent of oils and incense now carries something fainter: smoke, sweat, and dust. The perfumed goats are still remembered, but fewer are seen. Empires like fragrances fade. In the early days of the Roman Empire, The senator's obsession with perfumed goat oil had reached its peak. Merchants thrived, farms specialized in aromatic herbs, and every nobleman owned at least one amphora of scented fat, aged like wine. But by the 3rd century CE, a subtle shift was underway, one that mirrored the empire's own transformation from republic to bureaucracy, from living ritual to routine. As wars multiplied and the treasury strained, luxury itself began to smell suspicious. Stoic philosophers, already uneasy with excess, called for simplicitas, the virtue of plainness. Clean skin was now nobler than perfumed skin. The smell of a man, wrote Seneca, is no smell at all. The ideal Roman scent had changed from goat musk to nothingness, the fragrance of restraint, yet habits die slowly. Even as austerity gained fashion, the Senate chambers still held echoes of their scented past. Some old senators clung to the tradition, rubbing faint oil behind their ears as if to hold on to memory. To them, goat musk was not vanity, it was identity, a reminder that Rome had once smelled of power and purpose. But outside those chambers, the world was changing. Christianity was spreading, bringing with it a new philosophy of the body, one that distrusted scent and ornament. Incense was sacred only in worship. Personal perfume became a mark of vanity or sin. The goat, once a symbol of purity and divine blessing, was reimagined as an emblem of lust and temptation. The same musk that once meant virtue now whispered corruption. Temples closed, bathhouses emptied, and the perfumed farms of Campania fell silent. The ointment goats vanished into history, their herders turning to simpler trades. Within a few generations, the recipe for goat oil perfume was forgotten. The glass bottles that once glowed amber in the lamplight were buried, sealed in ashes or sand. Still, Rome itself remembered, not in scent, but in story. When later historians wrote of the Old Republic, they described it as a world of excess. They spoke of men who perfumed their beards and oiled their feet, as though to mock them. Yet behind the satire lay a quiet nostalgia. For the Romans, smell had always been memory, invisible yet enduring. Even when the scent was gone, its trace lingered in the mind. Like music you can't unhear. Modern archaeologists have found tiny perfume bottles buried beside senators' tombs, flasks still crusted with resin, faintly sweet when opened. Imagine that moment, 2,000 years later, a trace of goat musk rising again into the air. The same scent that once filled the Senate hall, now drifting into the sterile light of a museum. The past breathing once more quietly, and it tells you something simple, something human. The perfumed goat was never truly about goats or oils or vanity. It was about control, the eternal Roman dream of taming nature, to take the raw scent of an animal and refine it until it spoke of civilization, to turn musk into virtue, smell into power. That dream built aqueducts, paved roads, and conquered continents. It's the same impulse that drives every empire, to polish the world until it gleams, even if in doing so, it forgets what it once smelled like. But scent has a way of returning. When Renaissance scholars rediscovered Pliny's natural history, they found his recipes for perfumes and ointments. A few adventurous alchemists tried to recreate them. The results? Unbearably strong, they wrote, like the smell of the stable disguised as the temple. And yet even then there was wonder. They realized that the Romans didn't fear the smell of life. They wore it proudly. You can still catch that memory if you close your eyes. Marble floors, slick with oil, senators brushing past in togas, laughter echoing through baths scented with herbs and musk. Somewhere in the courtyard, a goat shifts its hooves, its horns gleaming with olive oil, its coat perfumed with thyme. The scent rises, faint, ancient, persistent. Perhaps that's what Rome really left behind. Not just ruins and roads, but the memory of refinement, the idea that even the smallest, dullest things can be shaped into symbols. That power is sometimes not in the sword but in the scent that lingers after it's gone. And so as the empire crumbled and marble turned to dust, the perfumed goats disappeared, but their story endured. Because history, like perfume, clings to what it touches. It fades but never truly vanishes. And maybe, in some small way, that's comforting. Because it means that even the strangest obsessions, even perfumed goats, can tell us something real about being human. The Romans sought beauty in smell. We seek meaning in memory. Both perhaps are ways of holding on to what cannot be seen. And so tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember this. Power once smelled of goats. Civilization was once measured in scent, and the air of history, even now, still carries the faintest trace of musk. In the spring of 717 CE, the Arab armies of the Umayyad Caliphate gathered outside the Theodosian walls. Those vast triple defenses that ringed Constantinople like a stone crown. The empire inside was tired. The treasury was empty. The grain ships were late. And the officials, those quiet ink-fingered men who lived in the shadow of the palace, were still arguing about which office was responsible for sharpening the quills. You'd expect chaos. But what you'd find was silence. Because in Constantinople everything was written down. The Byzantine Empire, proud heir of Rome, was held together not just by soldiers but by scrolls, seals, and signatures. Every ration of grain, every barrel of oil, every horse and helmet had to be approved, recorded, stamped, and archived. And so, while the caliph's troops camped outside, the clerks inside debated forms. Should a new requisition for arrows go through the Chartophylax or the logothete of the Genicon? Should the Navy's cooks be paid from the military fund or the ceremonial fund? Each answer required a meeting. Each meeting required minutes. And each minute meant another day that the city waited. From the outer walls you could hear the dull rhythm of hammers, the Arabs building siege engines. Inside you could hear another rhythm, the scratching of pens. The city was defending itself on two fronts, stone and parchment. To understand this sleepy siege, you have to understand how Byzantine bureaucracy worked. It was both a marvel and a maze. The empire had offices for everything, for taxes on olives, for counting monks, for measuring the size of fish caught in imperial waters. Each file sealed with wax was stored in a vast archive in the palace, guarded as carefully as the emperor himself. It was dull work, endless tables of figures, lists of villages, names of missing mules. Yet it was this boring machinery that had kept the empire alive for centuries. While other kingdoms rose and fell, Byzantium endured, not through swords, but through scrolls still during a siege. That same precision became paralysis. When the Arab fleet appeared in the Marmara Sea, the city's defense plan required signatures from three separate departments: the Navarch's office, the logothete of the fleet, and the imperial treasury. Each refused to act without the other's consent. By the time the papers reached the emperor's desk, the ships had already begun to block the harbor. The emperor at the time, Leo III, was a soldier from Syria, practical, blunt, and deeply frustrated. When he took the throne, the ink was still drying on half the orders needed to pay the troops. So Leo did something shocking. He ignored the paperwork. He called his officers together and said, "If the pen delays the sword, cut the pen in half." It was a rare moment of rebellion against the Byzantine habit of hesitation. Still, even Leo couldn't escape the empire's addiction to documentation. Within days, scribes were already recording his words, filing them neatly under emergency directives. Siege of the Arabs. Bureaucracy had survived again. But as strange as it sounds, this mountain of parchment saved the city. Because while the soldiers fought on the walls, inside a different battle raged, one of information. The clerks knew where every grain store lay, how many men each district could feed, and which fountains still flowed with clean water. Their ledgers became maps of survival. When fire broke out, they could calculate which quarter to seal off first. When bread ran low, they knew how to ration it by rank and household. The siege dragged on month after month. Outside, the enemy's catapults rained stones. Inside, clerks copied receipts for every bag of flour, and somehow, through sheer order, the city held. By the second winter, famine and disease began to thin the besiegers' ranks. The Byzantine navy, finally freed from paperwork, launched ships armed with Greek fire, a terrifying weapon that clung to water and flame alike. The sight of burning ships turned the tide, but the real victory belonged to the quiet men in the offices who kept the ledgers balanced and the city breathing. When the siege finally ended in 718 CE, Leo's soldiers celebrated. The scribes did not. They simply picked up their pens and began writing the official record of victory, 6 volumes long, sealed with ribbons, stored in the imperial archive where no one would read them for centuries. And that's what makes this story beautifully boring. An empire survived because its clerks refused to panic or to hurry. Even as the city trembled, they kept doing what Byzantines did best: recording, filing, archiving. Their calm persistence built a wall stronger than stone, a paper wall that outlasted kingdoms. So the next time you imagine a siege, picture not only the shouting soldiers but also the silent rooms behind them, the smell of ink, the dim flicker of oil lamps, and the slow, steady scratching of pens. Because sometimes survival is not about courage, it's about consistency. And yet you can't help but wonder, if paperwork saved the city once, could it also be the reason Byzantium grew too slow to save itself the next time? The siege of 717-718 ended, but the habit of paperwork did not. In fact, it grew stronger, thicker, slower, and strangely serene. You see, victory convinced the Byzantines that bureaucracy worked. The clerks had outlasted the catapults. The ledgers had proven stronger than the siege towers. And so what had begun as necessity became a philosophy. The Byzantine Empire decided that survival itself was an administrative art, one that required patience, precision, and an unshakable faith in forms. By the 9th century, Constantinople had become less a city and more a filing cabinet made of marble. Inside the great palace, corridors led not to gardens or armories, but to archives. Every transaction, from a farmer's barley tax to a bishop's travel expense, was recorded, sealed, and filed under layers of bureaucracy that only a handful of men could navigate. At the center of this web sat the logothetes, high-ranking administrators whose titles sound like poetry to anyone who loves dullness. There was the logothete of the drome, in charge of the postal routes, the logothete of the genicon, finance, the logothete of the herds, yes, livestock, and the logothete of the secrets, spies, and state correspondence. Every report, every decree passed through them, copied, approved, annotated, and sealed with a signature that sometimes took days to dry. Even the emperor's orders required clerical confirmation. In Byzantium, authority did not flow downward. It trickled sideways through ink. But the strangest thing, this endless paperwork made the empire peaceful. While neighboring kingdoms rose and fell in quick bursts of ambition, the Byzantine machine moved with glacial calm. It rarely conquered, but it rarely collapsed. Its borders shifted slowly like the tide. Its citizens grumbled, but they ate. Its cities might have been quiet, but they were safe. Bureaucracy, for all its dullness, became Byzantium's form of meditation. If you could walk into one of those offices, say, the Sicilian, where imperial revenues were counted, you'd see clerks sitting in rows, Candles flickering, fingers stained with ink. No one shouted. No one rushed. The sound was steady. The rustle of parchment, the whisper of quills, the faint clink of wax seals cooling on bronze tables. The clerks themselves were anonymous, often eunuchs or minor scholars who had trained for years in copying script. Their handwriting was their identity. A beautiful, steady hand could mean a lifetime of employment. A messy one could end a career. These men rarely traveled beyond the palace walls. Their world was ruled by margins, red ink, and the fear of misspelling an emperor's name. And yet, in their quiet precision, they built a kind of immortality. Every event, every drought, festival or embassy, passed through their pens. They turned life into record, chaos into category. Even disasters were calmly indexed. When an earthquake struck Constantinople in 869, collapsing the Hagia Sophia's dome, the record simply notes, structural damage assessed, masonry to be repaired when funds allow. No panic, no emotion, just process. This is the rhythm that defined Byzantium's middle centuries, an empire half asleep, half awake, never fully alive, never quite dead. The outside world called them decadent. Inside, they called it discipline. For them, stillness was safety. A rushed empire dies, a slow one endures. But over time, the paperwork that had once saved the city began to smother it. Every reform required a signature. Every military order needed approval from 5 offices. Generals complained that by the time a campaign was approved, the enemy had already moved on. Merchants groaned as their goods sat in ports waiting for imperial seals. Even art was not spared. Icon painters had to submit designs for approval. The color of halos, the height of thrones, the length of beards. One artist joked that it takes longer to paint permission than paint Christ, and still the system endured. Because the Byzantines feared collapse more than boredom, one chronicler writing around 1020 CE described it perfectly. We preserve the world by delay. It sounds absurd, yet it worked. While Western Europe fell into feudal chaos, Byzantium's bureaucracy quietly maintained hospitals, aqueducts, orphanages, and postal routes. Tax collectors delivered revenue with almost religious punctuality. Monks copied books in triplicate. Doctors logged every fever in ink. It was an empire built on routine. And for nearly 1,000 years it kept civilization breathing. But underneath that calm surface, something was shifting. Paperwork could preserve, but it could not inspire. As centuries passed, Byzantium became so organized that it forgot how to change. Innovation required chaos, and chaos had been outlawed. So the empire aged, slowly and beautifully, like parchment yellowing in the dark. When enemies appeared, Normans from the west, Turks from the east, the clerks recorded each invasion with the same calm tone as an overdue tax. Hostile forces cited, recommendations pending. By the time approvals came, the borders had moved again, and so the same system that once defended Constantinople began to dull its reflexes. The empire didn't fall with a scream. It exhaled softly like a candle going out. Still, there is something hauntingly admirable in that calm. Imagine a world where every decision, no matter how urgent, had to be written beautifully before being acted upon. Where ink replaced impulse. Where the act of writing, slow, deliberate, meditative, was the act of ruling. It's easy to laugh at that slowness now, but maybe in its own sleepy way Byzantium found peace. Because what is bureaucracy if not a form of prayer, a repetition of the same small motions day after day, believing that order itself will keep the world from falling apart. But as the centuries turned and the ink grew thicker than the blood on the frontiers, one question began to whisper through the marble halls of the great palace. When the empire finally needs to act, will anyone remember how? By the 13th century, Constantinople was old, not in ruins but in rhythm. The city still shone, its domes reflecting the sun over the Golden Horn, but its heartbeat had slowed. The offices of the logothetes still hummed with quiet devotion. Quills still scratched parchment, seals still cooled on bronze plates, reports still traveled through 100 careful hands. But outside the palace, the world was changing faster than the ink could dry. Merchants from Venice and Genoa now ruled the seas with restless speed. Their ships darted between ports like gossip, carrying spices, silver, and ideas that never waited for permission. In their eyes, Byzantium was a beautiful relic, a museum still charging admission. Inside the city walls, the empire's administrators remained certain of their system. "We endure by order," they told themselves. "We survive by patience." And for a time that was true. But the old rhythm of bureaucracy, steady, sacred, slow, had turned into a lullaby. An empire that once defended itself through meticulous paperwork now defended its paperwork through itself. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade appeared, not a wave of holy warriors but of accountants with swords. They marched not for faith but for unpaid debts. Venice had financed the crusade and the crusaders owed money. Constantinople, rich and quiet, looked like a solution. When their fleet arrived, the city's defense orders were trapped, as always, in paperwork. The navy required imperial approval to launch, but the emperor was away at a ceremony. The treasurer needed 2 seals to release funds for fuel. The general needed written confirmation that his troops were authorized to fight, though the enemy was already at the gates. The archives recorded all, dryly, with no emotion. Delays in communication, naval response incomplete. Within days, the greatest city of the medieval world was breached, not by strength but by speed. The Crusaders looted the Hagia Sophia. Statues were melted for coin. Horses were stabled inside churches. The empire's ledgers burned, curling into ash. Centuries of careful script vanishing into the wind. To the clerks who survived, it must have felt like the end of language itself. Their world had been made of words, and now words were burning. But even then, the bureaucracy refused to die. Within a decade, the Byzantines rebuilt their administration in exile. They made new stamps, rewrote lost decrees, recopied surviving records. When they finally reclaimed Constantinople in 1261, the first thing they restored wasn't the walls or the markets, it was the archives. Because for the Byzantines, paper was power. To record something was to make it real again, and yet, the empire that returned was smaller, slower, quieter. Its officials still filled parchment with calm reports, but the tone had changed. More notes ended with words like funds unavailable or repairs postponed. The great city was still magnificent, but like an old scholar, it survived more through memory than movement. Outside the walls, new powers stirred, the Ottoman Turks, who understood both faith and urgency. They built fast, fought fast, decided fast. Their bureaucracy existed too, but it was lean, alive, hungry. They used ink to move, not to pause. When the final siege came in 1453, Constantinople faced it with quiet dignity. There was no panic, only procedure. Reports were filed daily until the last week. Even as cannon fire shook the ground, one chronicler wrote, "Records of the treasury have been copied to safety. Inventories to follow." On the dawn of May 29th, when the walls finally broke, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine II, fought on the battlements, sword in hand. Inside the palace, somewhere in a half-lit room, a clerk sealed one final document. We don't know what it said. Perhaps an order, perhaps a prayer. When the Ottomans entered the city, they found the archives intact. Piles of parchment lay untouched. Ledgers of taxes, lists of clergy, shipping manifests, agricultural tallies, even marriage contracts awaiting signatures. History's greatest siege ended, and the desks were still organized. Centuries later, modern historians marvel at this. Byzantium's end was not loud, but perfectly neat. Its fall was written in beautiful handwriting. Its decline was documented with grace, and that is the strange beauty of the Byzantine way. They didn't rage against decay. They archived it. Each signature, each slow approval, each duplicate copy was a way of saying, "We will preserve the world by describing it." And maybe, in some sleepy sense, they succeeded. Because while countless empires vanished with shouts and smoke, Byzantium left behind a whisper, thousands of pages that still survive today. Through them, we can read the calm heartbeat of a civilization that believed order could hold back time, and in a way it did, for 1,000 years. If the Romans built with stone, the Chinese built with scrolls. While emperors wore silk and gold, the true rulers, and the ones who actually made things work, sat cross-legged in wooden offices, dipping their brushes into black ink. Day after day, their world was made of numbers, names, and reports. Rice harvests from the south, tax tallies from the west, census lists of villages so small even the emperor might never hear their names. And yet every detail mattered, because in the mind of the Chinese state, to write something down was to make it real. A village that was not recorded did not exist. A man without a name on a register was not a citizen. Paper, ink, and accuracy. That was how the empire ruled an entire continent. The officials who kept these records were called scribes and clerks, but they were more like engineers of order. They built invisible machines, systems that connected the emperor's palace to distant farms thousands of miles away. Each month, they copied figures by hand: how many oxen had been born, how many acres had flooded, how much grain was in storage. The reports traveled north on horse carts sealed in bamboo tubes tied with red string. Sometimes the journey took weeks. When the scrolls finally arrived, palace scribes logged them into the central registry, a mountain of paper that grew taller every year. It was slow, repetitive, and deeply boring. But it worked. By the year 100 CE, the Han bureaucracy had counted nearly 60 million people, with no computers, no typewriters, no calculators. Just ink, brushes, and a near-religious devotion to detail. It was said that an ideal scribe could copy 10,000 characters in a single day, and if even one was wrong, he'd begin again. A missed stroke on a name could change a tax rate. A smudge on a number could start an investigation. To modern ears, this might sound tedious, a nightmare of paperwork. But to the Han administrators, it was harmony. Each record was a note in a massive silent symphony, the empire's heartbeat written in ink. The system was so advanced that officials were graded not by personality or favor, but by the quality of their handwriting. Imperial exams measured brush control, grammar, and moral philosophy, because to write beautifully was to think clearly. The empire believed that good calligraphy revealed a good soul. If your brush strokes were calm and balanced, perhaps your heart was too. Imagine that. Your career decided not by how loudly you spoke, but how quietly you wrote. Over centuries, this paper empire only grew. Dynasties rose and fell, but the records endured, copied, recopied, rewritten through fires, floods, and wars. Entire families devoted their lives to bureaucracy. Fathers taught sons the art of measuring taxes by weight of grain. Mothers reminded children to treat scrolls like living things. Never tear paper. You tear memory. And through that discipline, the Chinese state survived what few others could. Even when invaders toppled thrones, the offices kept working. Even when emperors fled, the scribes stayed at their desks, ink drying on their sleeves. The empire could lose armies and cities, but never its paperwork. That's how it kept coming back, century after century. For the ordinary people, this obsession with lists had quiet power. Every name, every number meant protection. Being on the record meant you mattered. You had a tax to pay, yes, but you also had a right to land, to harvest, to safety. It was bureaucracy as a form of belonging. And so, when the census collectors arrived on with their scrolls and seals, villagers lined up patiently. Some even dressed in their best clothes. They didn't mind the questions. They knew the ink would carry their names through time. The paper kingdom had found its rhythm, one that didn't depend on heroes or wars, but on endurance. Each brushstroke was a promise that the empire, however large, would not forget its people, but somewhere in that endless calm, a problem was growing, one that no record could capture. Because the more perfect the system became, the slower it got. Every scroll needed a copy. Every copy needed verification. Every error demanded a report, and every report required another report about the report. It was the price of perfection, a bureaucracy so efficient, it started to trap itself. And as the centuries passed, paper began to weigh heavier than power. When the Han Dynasty finally fell in 220 CE, it wasn't because of enemies from outside. It was because of paper from within. Too many rules, too many checks, too much waiting. Even as rebels gathered near the capital, the clerks were still reviewing census forms. One final archive note reads simply, "Pending approval for military funds. Awaiting signature." That line, perhaps more than any sword, ended an empire, and yet the paper survived. Copied by new dynasties, respected by conquerors, imitated by the world. The idea that order could outlive chaos, that ink could outlast war, began here. Even today, historians read those old scrolls and realize this wasn't a failure. It was a philosophy. To the ancient Chinese, writing wasn't just communication. It was immortality. As you drift to sleep tonight, imagine those quiet rooms again. The candlelight flickering on inkstone bowls, the rustle of paper as thousands of clerks filled the night with soft brushstrokes, each one whispering the same calm promise. The empire endures, as long as the ink does. The fall of the Han Dynasty could have been the end. Rebellions, famines, and warlords tore China apart. Yet through all that noise, the quiet sound of writing never stopped. Every new ruler who rose from the chaos understood one truth. To rule China, you didn't need just soldiers. You needed scribes, because power written on paper lasted longer than power shouted on horseback. By the 7th century, under the Tang Dynasty, China rediscovered its rhythm. This was an empire that adored beauty, poetry, music, calligraphy, but its real masterpiece was still its paperwork. The Tang emperors built one of the most complex bureaucratic systems the world had ever seen. A network of scholars, accountants, inspectors, and archivists, each one trained to think in calm, measured strokes. No one was born into office anymore. You had to earn it, not with a sword, but with a brush. This was the birth of the imperial examination system, or Iju. A man from a small village with no title or name could study the Confucian classics by candlelight for years, then travel to the capital and sit for the exams. If he passed, his name would be written on carefully one in black ink on the imperial register. That ink would change his life. Imagine the room. Thousands of scholars sitting in silence, each with a single sheet of paper. No murmurs, no movement, just the scratching of brushes, 1,000 dreams unfolding line by line. They wrote about virtue, history, duty, balance, the things that made an empire stable. There was no applause when they finished. Only a clerk who nodded, stamped their paper, and sent it on its slow journey through the review offices. Weeks later, the results were posted publicly, and sometimes entire villages celebrated when one man's name appeared. He wasn't just a scholar now. He was part of the machinery that held China together, and in that quiet, grinding system of exams and reports, the world's first meritocracy was born. But it was not an easy life. Once inside the bureaucracy, scholars found themselves buried in endless lists, ledgers, and decrees. Every report needed a summary, every summary a copy, every copy a countercopy. If an official misfiled a single scroll, it could cost him his career. If he misplaced a seal, it could cost him his freedom. Yet many of them found peace in the monotony. They believed the act of perfect record-keeping was a moral exercise, a meditation on precision and humility. One Tang official wrote in his diary, "When the brush moves without tremor, the heart too is still." By the 9th century, paper had become the empire's lifeblood. Factories along the Yellow River produced it in vast quantities. Inspectors visited mills to check quality. Because the emperor's words could not be printed on weak paper, every layer of society depended on the bureaucracy's quiet accuracy. Tax collectors, governors, priests, even poets. A bad harvest might destroy a crop, but a bad record could destroy trust. That's why the empire's archives were guarded like treasure. The storage halls were built from stone, sealed with iron doors, and constantly checked for moisture. Some scribes slept inside them, watching over the records through the night. Because if fire or mold destroyed the scrolls, part of China's soul would vanish with them. When the Song dynasty rose in the 10th century, the paper kingdom transformed again. This time, the empire's administrators weren't just copying history, they were inventing it. Under the Song, China developed movable type printing, centuries before Europe. Suddenly, officials didn't have to rewrite every decree by hand. They could print dozens of identical copies. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of discovering flight. Orders moved faster. Reports multiplied. Records became more standardized. But as the empire became more efficient, it also became heavier. More forms, more signatures, more reviews. The Song government employed hundreds of thousands of clerks, all moving paper, stamping documents, verifying seals. A single tax reform might take 5 years just to process through all the proper offices. When officials joked, they called themselves the Empire of Ink, and yet the Song bureaucracy was strangely gentle. It didn't worship war or conquest, it worshipped order. Confucian ideals taught that stability was the highest virtue. Even boredom, they believed, could be sacred, a sign that peace had settled in. An official who died at his desk, surrounded by scrolls, was considered honorable. The empire might forget generals, but it never forgot record keepers. Sometimes, though, this devotion bordered on absurdity. There are stories, real ones, of clerks who spent weeks debating the correct shade of red for an imperial seal. Or offices that delayed grain shipments because a single character was written slightly crooked on the order form. But to them, these were not small things. Every stroke mattered because every stroke represented a promise. The empire had survived for centuries not through brilliance, but through carefulness. And carefulness, in a way, was its quiet rebellion against chaos. By the late Song period, even the smallest towns had offices filled with paper. Census lists, rice ledgers, tax accounts, school registers, land maps, examination results, all cataloged, all cross-checked. From the mountains of Sichuan to the ports of Fujian, everything was connected by records. The empire was no longer a place, it was a process. And that process was written on billions of brushstrokes. But beyond the walls of the record halls, something was changing again. Trade was booming. Merchants, sailors, and artisans were moving faster than the paperwork could track them. New money, new ideas, new risks, all traveling quicker than any imperial clerk could copy. The empire of ink was facing a problem as old as time. What happens when the world starts moving faster than your records? That question, still unanswered, began to ripple through the corridors of power. And deep within the capital's archives, an aging scribe dipped his brush one more time, whispering, "Ink endures. But can order?" The Song dynasty's paper kingdom stood for centuries, its bureaucracy so vast that it touched almost every human life in China. But nothing lasts forever, not even perfect paperwork. When the Mongols arrived in the 13th century riding hard from the northern steppes, they didn't understand the obsession with records. They saw a city of scrolls, libraries, and ledgers, and they saw opportunity. Instead of burning the archives, the Mongols did something unexpected. They kept them. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis, realized that the Chinese bureaucratic system, this slow, meticulous organism of clerks and paper, could govern his new empire better than any army. And so he preserved it. The Mongol rulers adopted the Chinese model almost completely. They replaced emperors but not accountants. It's one of the quietest revolutions in history. A nomadic empire ruled by writers, held together by scribes. Under the Yuan dynasty, paperwork became the glue that bound different peoples. Mongols, Chinese, Persians, Tibetans, under one administration. Every horse counted, every soldier registered, every shipment logged. The Mongols learned quickly that paper could do what swords could not. It could organize the world. And when their empire eventually dissolved, the idea of bureaucracy, government through documents, didn't vanish. It deepened. Because once a civilization learns that ink can rule, it never forgets. By the 14th century, the Ming dynasty restored native Chinese rule and took paperwork to unimaginable heights. The empire's archives filled entire cities, literally. In the capital of Nanjing, the Ministry of Revenue's files were stored in 40 vast halls lined with bamboo shelves. By the 15th century, there were over 10 million records cataloged and maintained by thousands of clerks. Every farmer, every field, every birth and death, recorded. One Jesuit visitor in the 1600s wrote, "Odd, they count their people as one counts the stars, calmly, without haste, but without end." The Ming emperors were proud of their order. They believed that control was moral. A well-kept archive was a reflection of heaven's balance, and yet this perfection brought its own curse. As the empire aged, the paper mountain grew too high. By the late Ming period, officials complained that no one could find anything anymore. Reports were duplicated 5 or 6 times, each stamped and sealed and then buried beneath others. Petitions could take years to reach the emperor. A local magistrate once joked, "The only thing faster than corruption is a missing file." When the Qing dynasty took power in 1644, they inherited this mountain of ink, and as always chose to preserve it. Even the Manchu conquerors, foreign to the land they ruled, kept the Chinese bureaucratic system almost intact. They saw in it a kind of timeless wisdom. That paperwork, however dull, outlived chaos. The Qing expanded the examination system, refined the ledgers, and updated the tax registers. By the 18th century, the empire's record stretched across more than 5,000 kilometers. A paper network connecting peasants in the Himalayas to officials in Beijing. It was magnificent and exhausting. And then came the modern world. Steam, telegraphs, and trade ships began to move faster than any bureaucrat's brush. The empire's paperwork, once its strength, began to slow it down. A report that took a month to travel by horse was now outdated by the time it arrived. When Western powers came knocking, demanding ports, trade, and treaties. The imperial system struggled to respond. Officials still preferred to discuss policy in ink, not action. They debated wording while the world redrew maps. One frustrated reformer wrote in 1895, "Our paper is endless, but our time is gone." It was the quiet tragedy of an empire that couldn't adapt, a civilization that had perfected stability, just as the world discovered speed, and yet, in a strange and sleepy way, China's old bureaucracy didn't die. It simply transformed. When the modern Chinese Republic emerged in the early 20th century, it borrowed heavily from those ancient systems: filing, registration, documentation, standard forms. Even today, the structure of government offices across East Asia echoes the old imperial ministries, proof that the paper kingdom never truly fell. Its logic survived because it was deeply human. People trust the written word. It makes order feel real. Think about it. A clerk in ancient Chang'an checking tax lists on bamboo slips. A civil servant in 19th century London drafting reports in ledgers. A modern office worker typing on a computer screen. All of them, in some way, are descendants of the same idea: that writing can control chaos. That recording something gives it shape. That order, even if boring, is a kind of comfort. Today, historians can still read the old Chinese archives. Many survived because of that same bureaucratic obsession with preservation. The handwriting may be faded, but it's legible, steady, calm, deliberate. You can trace the same brushstrokes through 2,000 years of administration. A civilization whispering to itself across the centuries, saying, "We are still here. We remember." And maybe that's the quiet lesson of the paper kingdom. Not every legacy needs to roar. Some endure through patience, through filing cabinets and ink pots, through the humble beauty of doing small things well. For centuries, the empire built on paper outlasted every conqueror, every war, every revolution. Because while power fades, writing waits. So as you drift off tonight, imagine that sound. The slow rhythm of brushes gliding on paper. The quiet breathing of clerks who believed they were recording eternity. The endless patience of a civilization that chose ink over fire. A world asleep, but still writing. A kingdom made not of gold or glory, but of paper. In the long, quiet centuries after Rome's fall, Europe forgot many things. Cities crumbled, aqueducts dried, and roads turned back to dirt. But in the monasteries, hidden behind stone walls and silence, a few small habits of order survived. One of them was boiling water. To most medieval people, clean water was a luxury, not a routine. Rivers were shared with animals. Wells went stagnant, and even kings often drank weak ale instead of plain water. But the monks, they boiled. Not because they knew about bacteria or disease or hygiene. They did it because it felt holy, to purify, to cleanse, to prepare, and that was their rhythm. Before prayer, before cooking, before medicine, a slow bubbling of copper pots became the monastery's heartbeat. If you walked into a Benedictine abbey around the year 900, you would smell the faint scent of smoke and herbs, rosemary, sage, sometimes lavender. You would hear dripping water echoing through the cloister halls, carried from stone basins to kitchens and baths. Monks were required by rule to wash regularly, their faces, hands and feet, and to bathe completely before certain holy days. To the outside world, this looked extravagant, but to them it was discipline. The rule of Saint Benedict said, "Let all things be done with measure." Cleanliness wasn't vanity, it was obedience. By the 10th century, these habits spread quietly across Europe. Every monastery built its own lavatorium, a long trough of flowing water where monks washed before meals. Some even constructed primitive hot baths, warmed by furnaces beneath stone floors, an invention centuries ahead of its time. These were not spas or luxuries. They were acts of devotion, a way to imitate divine order through daily routine. Boiling water, washing robes, cleaning cups. It was all prayer in motion. It's almost funny. In a sleepy way, how this simple rhythm made monks some of the healthiest people in Europe. While townsfolk drank contaminated river water, the monks' insistence on purity quietly saved lives. They brewed their own beer too, not for pleasure, but because boiling the water made it safe. Their liquid bread, as they called it, was one of history's first forms of sterilization. Without knowing it, they had turned religion into science, and boredom into survival. Monks were record keepers as well. They wrote down the timing of baths, the preparation of herbs, and the cleaning of wounds. These small notes, copied and recopied for centuries, became the foundation for medieval medicine. A 12th century text from the monastery of Monte Cassino describes how to mix boiled water with crushed mint to soothe stomach illness. Another, from Cluny, warns against drinking cold spring water after fasting, lest the humors rebel. They didn't yet understand microbes, but they sensed patterns. That warmth healed, that stillness calmed, that cleanliness preserved life. In the great silence of those stone halls, they were doing something revolutionary. They were paying attention. The world outside was noisy. Wars, trade, feasts, famine. But inside the cloisters, time slowed down enough for observation to exist. When you repeat a simple act, boiling, cleaning, writing, for 300 years, you start to see connections no one else does. You see that boiling water before healing a wound helps more than prayer alone. You see that order creates peace. You see that boredom, done properly, becomes understanding. It was this patient repetition that laid the groundwork for modern science. Every experiment, every hypothesis began with the same rhythm the monks had already mastered: observation, repetition, reflection. They didn't chase discovery. They tended it. Their curiosity wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and circular. They repeated what worked, adjusted what didn't, and passed it on. Each monastery became a living laboratory of slow progress. By the 13th century, these small habits evolved into the foundations of medieval hospitals and universities. The monks' sanitary customs influenced architecture itself: running water systems, separate kitchens, drainage. When the Black Death came in the 14th century, monasteries that followed strict cleaning routines fared better than most villages. It wasn't divine protection. It was boiled water. And perhaps that's the heart of this sleepy story. Progress doesn't always come from brilliance. Sometimes it comes from boredom done well, from the patient act of doing something simple over and over until it becomes perfect. The monks didn't set out to invent hygiene or scientific observation. They just wanted to live in a state of quiet order. But in doing so, they preserved the habits that would one day save millions of lives. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear it. The steady bubbling of water on stone hearths, the gentle scraping of hands against copper basins, the low hum of monks chanting as the steam rises. It's not dramatic. It's not heroic. But it's beautiful. Because in those small, careful acts, humanity learned again how to care for itself. If you were to wake early in a medieval monastery, say around the year 1100, you would hear the sound of bells before dawn. It was the call to matins, the first prayer of the day. Before they prayed, monks would wash their hands in cool water from a stone basin, carefully poured and reused again and again. The same gesture performed by thousands of hands, in thousands of monasteries every day for centuries. To the outside world, This might have looked like meaningless routine, but within those walls, routine was revelation. Every repetition was a kind of study. A monk's daily life was divided by bells. Each hour marked a task: prayer, work, reading, washing, rest. And through this strict rhythm, time became measurable, observable, predictable. This, historians say, was the birth of structured time in Europe. Before clocks, it was monks who measured the passing hours by sunlight, candles, and water. Their schedule demanded precision, not for productivity but for peace. And from that peace, small discoveries began to surface. In the 12th century, a group of Cistercian monks noticed that certain types of clay filters made their water clearer than others. They began experimenting with different soils and sands, not to invent filtration, but simply to obey their abbot's command for cleanliness in all things. Over time, they refined these methods. By the 13th century, some monasteries were producing the cleanest water in Europe. Centuries before germ theory existed, they had no microscopes, no chemistry, only patience. And patience, it turns out, is the truest scientific tool of all. The monks also observed patterns in plants. When tending their herb gardens, they noticed which herbs stayed fresh longer in boiled water. Mint, sage, and thyme, all antimicrobial, were favored for infusions and medicines. One recorded entry from a monk in the Abbey of St. Gall reads, "The mint stays sweet for 7 days if the water be boiled first. Without boiling, it turns bitter in 3. This quiet observation, written in brown ink on sheepskin parchment, is now recognized as one of the earliest references to sterilization by heat. But the monk didn't know that. He was just noting what he saw, calmly, faithfully, endlessly. Their boredom became data. Their obedience became research, and slowly, across centuries, those notes and habits turned into method. When scholars later founded universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, they adopted the same system: repetition, recording, revision that had been perfected by monks. The scientific method in its slowest, softest form was born in monasteries. It's strange to think that something so fundamental to modern science began not in curiosity, but in devotion. Not in discovery, but in duty. Monks copied everything by hand. Every herb recipe, every water note, every washing ritual. This copying itself created precision. Mistakes were noticed, corrected, discussed. If one monastery boiled water for 10 minutes and another for 15, someone somewhere wrote down the difference in taste or smell. Centuries later, those same notes would influence the early alchemists and physicians of Europe. Their discoveries weren't sudden bursts of insight. They were long, drowsy conversations between generations. Even the architecture of monasteries reflected this careful order. Water channels were built to run through the entire compound. Washing rooms, kitchens, gardens. Some abbeys had separate systems for drinking and washing water, centuries before city plumbing caught up. These were not engineers. They were caretakers of time and cleanliness. The Cistercian abbey at Clairvaux had running water in the 12th century, a feat unmatched in most of Europe until the 1800s, all because they believed that purity brought them closer to God. And yet, if you asked them what they had achieved, they would have said nothing. The monks didn't think they were changing history. They thought they were serving it, maintaining the fragile thread of order through dark, chaotic centuries. But sometimes, preservation is progress. Sometimes the world moves forward not through invention, but through care. The monks' slow, repetitive habit, boiling, cleaning, recording, became the foundation for everything that would later define the Enlightenment. Without them, there would be no preserved manuscripts, no continuity of learning, no scientific discipline. The irony is almost poetic. The people least interested in discovery became the guardians of discovery. The ones who avoided the world's noise kept its knowledge alive. Their boredom saved civilization. If you could walk through a monastery today, perhaps Monte Cassino or Cluny, you'd still find echoes of that rhythm. The sound of trickling fountains in stone courtyards, the faint scent of herbs drying in the sun, the same slow footsteps that once carried water from the well to the kettle. There's a strange peace in realizing that for 300 years, generation after generation of monks did the same quiet tasks every day. Boil water, copy text, wash hands, pray. It sounds dull, but in that dullness they found meaning. And in their meaning we found science. So the next time you sip tea, or wash your hands, or wait for water to boil, remember the thousands of unseen hands that did the same thing 1,000 years ago. Not for comfort, not for knowledge, but for faith, and somehow, that faith became understanding. By the dawn of the 15th century, Europe was changing. The silence of the monasteries was beginning to compete with the noise of cities, markets, workshops, universities. And yet, hidden beneath the new hum of progress, the habits of the monks lived on. The world was waking up from the long medieval night, and it was the quiet rhythm of boiled water and copied manuscripts that had kept the light alive. In universities from Paris to Prague, scholars still followed the rule of Saint Benedict in spirit, if not in faith. They observed, recorded, debated, and revised. The same cycle that had governed monastic study for centuries. When early medical schools began teaching hygiene, they didn't yet understand bacteria, but they did understand the monk's principle. Cleanliness brings clarity. Doctors of the 1400s prescribed boiled water for wounds, vinegar for cleaning instruments, and herbal infusions almost identical to those the monks brewed centuries earlier in stone kitchens. They didn't invent these ideas. They inherited them. At the same time, many monasteries themselves were changing. The printing press arrived, and with it, the slow art of copying by hand began to fade. But before it did, the monks managed one final miracle of patience. They copied their knowledge into printed form, texts. Like the Tarquinum Sanitatis, a medieval health guide based on monastic practices, became early bestsellers. They described daily routines, how to wash, how to eat, how to rest. Each page was an echo of 3 centuries of quiet observation. What had once been prayer had now become public knowledge. Even outside the cloisters, their influence was everywhere. Public bathhouses appeared in towns, many inspired directly by monastic designs. Hospitals, too, adopted their structure. Separate wards, clean linens, heated water. The first hospitals run by civic authorities in the 1500s still followed the same layout that monks had perfected long before. To the casual eye, it was simple sanitation, but to historians it was the moment when faith became function, when cleanliness shifted from a spiritual duty to a civic one. It's a quiet transformation, isn't it? No grand discovery, no single genius moment. Just a long chain of small, faithful acts. Boiling, washing, writing. Over and over, until those actions became civilization's default settings. And in a way, the monks might have smiled at that. Their goal had never been glory, it had been order. And order, they would say, is simply peace that repeats itself. Even the earliest chemists, the alchemists, owed their discipline to monastic patience. The tools of their trade were born in monasteries, alembics, crucibles, and distillation flasks, first used for brewing and medicine. When the Renaissance thinkers began studying natural philosophy, they built directly upon the monks' boring brilliance, their logs, their rules, their unbroken chains of experiment. The slow science of boiling water had become the first laboratory method, Fast forward a few hundred years more. Louis Pasteur in the 1800s would finally prove that boiling kills germs, the same act monks had performed out of faith for 3 centuries. He would call it pasteurization, and it would save millions of lives. He proved it with microscopes and glass flasks, but the principle had been there all along, in the humble rhythm of prayer and steam. It took 1,000 years for science to catch up with devotion, and that's what makes this story so quietly beautiful. It reminds you that progress doesn't always roar forward. Sometimes it hums softly in the background, kept alive by people who never sought to change the world, only to understand it through stillness. Those monks didn't need recognition. Their gift to history was the patience to repeat small truths until they became universal. Boiling water, washing hands, recording what they saw. That was enough. When you think about it, the modern world still moves by their rhythm. We live by clocks that trace their origin to monastic bells. We work in structured hours, take breaks, and value hygiene. All concepts they normalized. Even hospitals and laboratories echo the same architecture. White walls, running water, quiet order. Our science is built on their silence, so tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine that ancient rhythm still playing somewhere. The faint bubbling of water over a small fire. The soft hum of chants under vaulted stone. The simple beauty of repetition. 1,000 years of care echoing forward. Progress began, it seems, not with brilliance, but with boredom done beautifully. This is the great nap of Napoleon's army. A story about how the most ambitious army in Europe was undone not by battle, but by boredom, hunger, and the world's most disorganized lunch break. You've probably heard of Napoleon Bonaparte, the little man with the big plans. But what you may not know is that his armies were famous not just for their victories, but for how often they ran out of food. The French army of the early 1800s moved like a wave across Europe. Hundreds of thousands of men, horses, wagons, cooks, medics, and mapmakers, each trying to follow one brilliant, sleep-deprived general. But for all his genius on the battlefield, Napoleon had one great weakness. He underestimated how long it takes to make lunch. The French soldiers' daily ration was supposed to include bread, meat, wine, and salt. In theory, this sounded perfect, balanced, patriotic, even civilized. In reality, soldiers were often given raw grain and told to figure it out. They carried small iron pots called gamelles, and when the day's march ended, entire regiments would squat beside ditches or campfires, trying to turn a handful of flour into dinner before dark. Cooking took time. Water had to boil, dough had to bake, fires had to catch. But Napoleon's favorite phrase was vite vite, quickly. So meals were skipped. Fires went out. Soldiers slept hungry. In a way, the French army became a moving experiment in human patience. Men marched 40 kilometers on empty stomachs, their uniforms soaked in rain, their boots falling apart, all for a man who believed that speed is victory. But speed without food, it turns out, is exhaustion. As the empire expanded through Austria, Spain, and into the endless plains of Russia, the great French war machine began to slow down, one missed meal at a time. And yet in those long, hungry marches, something quietly fascinating happened. The soldiers became masters of improvisation. They learned to roast whatever they found, and horse meat, roots, even candle wax. They invented new recipes out of desperation. Bouillon cubes of bone and ash, bread baked on bayonets, soup made from melted snow and a few crumbs of salt. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Napoleon's army was the first truly self-sufficient military in Europe. Each soldier carried not only weapons but cooking tools, a portable kitchen that doubled as a science of survival. By 1807, the emperor realized his men were starving faster than they were conquering. So he announced a competition, a prize of 12,000 francs to anyone who could invent a way to preserve food for soldiers. A Parisian confectioner named Nicolas Appert took the challenge. For years he boiled food in sealed glass jars, testing and tasting until he found something miraculous and a way to keep meals edible for months without spoiling. This was the birth of canning. Napoleon called it the discovery that will feed armies. He wasn't wrong, it would later feed entire nations. But the irony is that by the time the method was perfected, his army was already falling asleep in the snow of Russia, waiting for supplies that never came. Imagine that moment. Hundreds of thousands of men sitting around dying campfires, half dozing in the frost, waiting for wagons that got lost on muddy roads. The French didn't lose the war in a blaze of glory. They lost it one skipped meal at a time. Hunger made soldiers slow. Cold made them still, and in the quiet of that stillness, Napoleon's empire began to dissolve. There's something oddly peaceful about it, though. In the end, history's greatest conqueror was defeated not by violence, but by the human need for rest. For all his speed, Napoleon forgot that every army marches not just on legs, but on lunch. The story of his hungry soldiers became a kind of legend among later generals. Logistics, the boring science of feeding and moving people, was finally recognized as the true secret of war. Because, as one old officer put it, strategy wins battles, but soup wins wars. And yet, for all its misery, those long marches also gave birth to small comforts. Songs, jokes, quiet naps by roadside fires. The slow moments of humanity that survive even in chaos. In the official reports, it's all dates and troop numbers. But in the soldiers' letters, it's mostly about food or the lack of it. One wrote to his wife from Poland, "We have seen the world, but no bread. Yet I dream each night of your kitchen." He survived. Many didn't. In a strange way, their exhaustion became a symbol of endurance, a reminder that even the greatest ambitions crumble if you forget to rest. The soldiers of the Grande Armée didn't fail because they were weak. They failed because they were human. And maybe that's why this story feels so right for a sleepy night. It's a reminder that even the most driven people need to pause, to eat, to breathe, to sleep. Because the world doesn't move faster when we skip rest. It just falls apart more quietly. As the French army stretched across Europe, its victories began to depend less on courage and more on calories. The faster Napoleon marched, the hungrier his men became. And somewhere between the battlefields and the breadlines, a new kind of science began to take shape. One born not from laboratories, but from campfires. Soldiers of the Grande Armée were often surrounded by abundance, fertile farmlands, rivers, villages, but they couldn't stop long enough to cook it. They lived in constant motion, chasing the emperor's next command. To survive, they improvised. Some carried small sacks of flour tied to their belts. When they reached a stream, they mixed it with water and baked rough flat bread on their bayonets over the fire. Others boiled horse bones until they dissolved into thick, gelatinous broth. One soldier described the process. "We boiled until the bones became white and the water brown. It was our feast and our fatigue." These small acts of survival spread through the ranks like folklore. Each regiment had its own secret recipe, its own rhythm of hunger and hope. And though they didn't know it, they were conducting experiments, testing what preserved best, what cooked fastest, what didn't rot overnight. It was the first large-scale field study of food preservation, led not by scientists but by starving soldiers. Back in Paris, Nicolas Appert worked quietly on his own problem. He had heard of the emperor's challenge. the 12,000 franc prize for anyone who could preserve food for the army. And he believed the answer was not salt or smoke, but heat. Appert began sealing cooked meals, soups, meats, vegetables, in glass jars. Then he placed the jars in boiling water for hours, believing that heat would drive away the air that spoils all things. It was a simple, almost monastic faith in cleanliness, the same principle that medieval monks had practiced for centuries. But unlike them, Appert wrote down every experiment, how long the jars boiled, how long they lasted before spoiling, how they looked, smelled, and tasted months later. Without knowing it, he was inventing food science. By 1809, Appert had his answer. Boil, seal, cool. That was the entire formula. He presented his method to the French government, and they awarded him the prize. His invention was called appertization. We now call it canning. Napoleon immediately saw its value. Food that could travel, survive the cold, and feed armies months later. It was a revolution far quieter than any cannon blast. But like so many revolutions, it came too late. When Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, his supply lines stretched hundreds of miles through mud and snow. Appert's glass jars, fragile, heavy, and precious, shattered in transport. Barrels leaked, bread froze, wine soured. And so the men once again turned to improvisation. They roasted leather straps, melted snow for soup, and traded buttons for scraps of grain from local peasants. They called it the March of Hunger. The strongest survived by resting more, eating less, and learning how to sleep in the cold. It was not victory, it was endurance. And yet from that suffering something beautiful survived. Appert's method inspired others. In 1810, a British inventor named Peter Durand replaced glass jars with tin cans, and soon after the Royal Navy adopted canned food to feed sailors across the world. What began as a desperate attempt to feed soldiers in war became the foundation of modern food preservation, a science that would one day feed explorers, travelers, and astronauts. Think of that for a moment. The same idea that once kept a French soldier alive on a frozen plain now keeps you fed in the calm of your kitchen. Soup in a can, beans on a shelf, fruit sealed in syrup, all of it born from the long, hungry marches of men who simply wanted to rest and eat. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the quiet connection between them and the monks from centuries before. Both boiling water, both chasing cleanliness, both finding survival in boredom. The monks boiled for faith. Appert boiled for science. Napoleon's soldiers boiled for life. Each in their own way, they stirred the same truth. Heat preserves. It's easy to romanticize history, to picture heroism, adventure, drama. But most of history's progress came from people too tired to be dramatic. People like Appert stirring soup for months on end, soldiers hunched by small fires in the dark, cooks counting jars and minutes. History moves not through moments of glory, but through long stretches of patience. When you open a can today, you're opening the quiet echo of those nights, the invention that came from exhaustion, hunger, and the wish for warmth, and that, in its sleepy way, might be the most human story of all. After the smoke cleared and the flags were folded, what remained was hunger, not the loud kind that roars through stomachs, but the quiet kind that lingers in memory. The soldiers who returned home brought stories of survival, how they boiled bones, baked flour paste, and rationed hope. They also brought a new kind of respect for food itself, not for its flavor, but for its endurance. In Paris, Nicolas Appert became a small celebrity. His method had saved countless lives, but he didn't become rich. He had given his invention freely to France, a patriot's gesture, noble but costly. He opened a small preservation factory, teaching apprentices how to seal food in glass jars. But the wars had drained the nation, and few could afford innovation in times of famine. Still, his idea on that food could last if treated with care spread slowly across the continent. By the mid-1800s, the tin can had replaced Appert's fragile glass. British sailors ate preserved meat while crossing oceans. Explorers heading into the Arctic packed tins of beans. And railway workers in America found comfort in canned peaches. Everywhere the modern world expanded, a can of food wasn't far behind. What had once been a soldier's necessity became a symbol of civilization's new pace. Faster, further yet somehow more stable. And with that change, the world began to sleep differently. Before the Industrial Revolution, dinner was fleeting, a moment between daylight and darkness. Food spoiled quickly. You ate what was fresh or went hungry. But now food waited. It could sit for weeks, even months. You didn't have to hurry. You could rest. In a quiet, accidental way, Appert's jars gave humanity more time. Time to think, to work, to sleep. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. Writers mocked the tin taste of preserved food. Sailors complained of can fatigue, and one London doctor famously called canned meat a diet fit for the machines that eat it. But despite its dullness, it persisted, because dull things often do. The things we rely on most aren't exciting. They're dependable, and that's exactly what preservation became. A boring miracle. It's strange to think that so much of modern life was built on boredom and hunger. The French soldiers wanted a meal. Appert wanted a method. The world wanted rest. And from those quiet wants came everything from school lunches to space rations. Every astronaut who eats aboard the ISS, every camper who opens a can of beans, is repeating a ritual born from war. They're echoing the same small prayer the soldiers once whispered over boiling water. Let this last until morning. There's a kind of poetry in that. In how the smallest solutions outlive their creators. Appert never imagined a grocery store shelf. He just wanted to feed his countrymen. And yet his idea, the act of sealing, heating, and waiting, became one of the foundations of our global food system. Today, you can trace his legacy in nearly every kitchen, every jar, every tin, every label, all descendants of that first humble experiment. If you ever feel like your work goes unnoticed, think of Nicholas Appert. His invention changed the world, but history barely remembers his name. He didn't lead armies or crown empires. He boiled jars in silence. He failed often, worked alone, and built something no one celebrated until long after he was gone. But that's the nature of boring history, the kind that shapes everything quietly. So tonight, as you rest, remember the soldiers who learned to sleep on frozen ground, and the man who taught the world to eat tomorrow's meal today. Their legacy isn't in battles or parades. It's in the soft click of a can opener, the comfort of food that waits for you, and the idea that even in exhaustion, invention endures. Maybe that's the lesson of the great nap of Napoleon's army. That progress often begins when we're too tired to move, too hungry to think, too human to stop trying. Even the smallest act, a pot of boiling water, can ripple through centuries. And somewhere, beneath the noise of history, you can still hear it, the quiet hum of soup cooling in a jar. And that's tonight's journey through sleepy, boring history, where even the smallest moments, from perfumed goats to canned soup, quietly shaped our world. Thank you for listening. Now close your eyes, rest easy, and let history do what it does best. Keep repeating softly while you fall asleep.